I used to imagine it so many times that I could swear I had already lived it. The day I'd finally see my son again. I could feel the weight of his arms wrapping around me. I could hear his voice cracking as he whispered, "I missed you so much, Mom." I played it over in my mind every night before falling asleep, like a lullaby I had written myself just to survive the distance. Years had passed. Not days, not months, but long, aching years. I missed him when I cooked, when I woke up, when I passed by the room that used to be his. Every inch of my life had a trace of him, and yet I hadn't held him in over a decade. Every Christmas, every birthday, I'd wait for a call. Sometimes it came, sometimes it didn't. But when it did, even just a, "Hey Mom, I've been busy, but I'm okay," I'd hang up the phone with my heart glowing. That was enough to keep me going for weeks, just knowing he still thought of me. He was all I had. He left when he was only 22, still a boy in so many ways. He used to cry easily back then, especially on nights when the electricity would go out and we'd have to light candles. I remember how tightly he'd hold my arm. "Don't leave me, Mom." And I'd smile, even if I was scared too, because that's what mothers do. We smile through the fear. We carry the world on our backs without letting them see us tremble. He left Brazil chasing a dream. "Just a few years, Mom. I'll send money. I'll come back and build you a house." And he did send money. Not much at first, but I wasn't counting. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted him safe and happy. The truth is, I never cared if he gave me anything. He had already given me everything the moment I heard his first cry in the hospital. When he finally invited me to visit, I couldn't breathe. I read the message over and over. "If you want, you can come for a week or two. The kids would love to meet you." I didn't sleep that night. I pulled out my old suitcase and started folding clothes in silence, even though the flight was still weeks away. I hadn't been on a plane in over 30 years. I had never left the country, but none of that mattered. I was going to see my son. That boy I raised with nothing but love and borrowed hope. At the airport, I waited and waited. The minutes dragged like hours. And when I finally saw him walking toward me, tall, older, different, my legs almost gave out. But he didn't run. He didn't cry. He looked around first, checked his phone. Then, almost as if it pained him, he hugged me briefly. "Mom, let's go. We shouldn't stay here long." I laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. "Why not, meu filho? It's just the arrivals area." He didn't answer. In the car, the silence was heavy. He asked about the flight, about the weather back home, but never once looked me in the eye. I tried to talk about old times, his first bike, the mango tree he used to climb. But he kept checking the GPS, adjusting the radio, changing the subject. I thought maybe he was just tired. Maybe work was stressing him. Maybe I was overthinking. But deep down, a knot had already formed in my stomach. Something wasn't right. The drive was long. I looked out the window, trying to memorize every building, every light post. "So this is where you live now," I whispered. "It's beautiful." He nodded, still not smiling. When we pulled into his driveway, the house looked perfect. A lawn trimmed like a magazine cover. Curtains drawn neatly. A big car parked outside. My heart swelled with pride. He did it. My boy made it. He helped me with my suitcase but didn't open the front door right away. "Just wait here for a second," he said. I watched him go inside, heard muffled voices, a woman's voice, his wife, then nothing. Minutes later, the door opened halfway. He waved me in quickly. "Come in, but be quiet, okay?" I didn't understand. I had traveled thousands of miles. Why should I sneak into my own son's home? But I said nothing. I stepped inside, took off my shoes, and smiled at the first face I saw, my daughter-in-law. She didn't smile back. "Hello," I said softly. "It's so good to finally meet you." She nodded, turned, and walked away. I stood there holding my coat, unsure of what to do. No welcome, no hug, no, "Let me show you your room." Just distance. My son cleared his throat. "You'll stay downstairs. It's more private." His voice was lower now, nervous, rushed. I followed him to the basement. It was cold, clean, but impersonal. A mattress on the floor, a small dresser, and a curtain instead of a door. "I know it's not much," he said, placing my suitcase down, "but it's safer here." Safer? I wanted to ask what he meant, but something in his eyes stopped me. He looked ashamed. I sat on the bed, unsure of what to feel. My hands shook as I opened my bag and unpacked the gifts I had brought. Handmade towels, sweets from our neighborhood, drawings from the local kids who still remembered him. I had thought they would bring smiles, laughter, nostalgia. But when I showed them to him later, he barely glanced. "They're nice," he said. "But don't leave them lying around, okay? The kids could ask questions." Ask questions? About their grandmother? I nodded and smiled again, the way mothers do when we feel our hearts shatter. That night, I laid awake staring at the ceiling. The pipes creaked above me. I could hear footsteps, whispers, the sound of a door locking. I closed my eyes and remembered the day he was born, the way he cried so loud the nurses laughed, the way he wrapped his tiny hand around my finger and wouldn't let go. Now I was in his house, his world, but I had never felt more like a stranger. And still, I told myself, it's okay. He's just nervous. He just needs time. He's scared. But scared of what? Of me? Of what I represent? A woman without papers? A woman from the past? A woman who didn't belong in this perfect life he had built? I started to understand then, piece by piece. Not all at once because it would have crushed me. But slowly, painfully, the truth began to form like a shadow at the edge of a room. He wasn't proud of me. He wasn't happy to see me. He had invited me because he felt obligated. Maybe his wife had insisted. Maybe the kids had asked too many questions. Maybe guilt, but not love. Never once did he say he missed me. Never once did he say he was glad I came. Even when I hugged him goodnight, his arms were stiff, barely touching me. I remember whispering, "I love you, meu filho," as I kissed his cheek. He didn't say it back, and that's when the pain became real, when it no longer felt like culture shock or nerves or misunderstanding. That's when I realized my own son was afraid of me. If you've ever felt invisible in the life of someone you helped build from nothing, if you've ever sat quietly in a room where your love felt like a burden, please share your story in the comments. Sometimes writing it down is the only way to stop your heart from screaming. If you feel comfortable, comment, "I've been there too." Your words might help someone else realize they're not alone. Let me know where you're watching from. I want to know where these stories are reaching hearts that still believe in love, even when it hurts. I thought maybe the next morning would be different. Maybe a good night's sleep would reset everything. Maybe he'd come downstairs, smile at me like he used to when he'd wake up early for school and sit at the table waiting for his toast. Maybe the grandkids would come running down, curious and excited to meet the grandmother they'd only seen in pictures, the woman who sent gifts every Christmas, even when I barely had enough for myself. But nothing happened. I waited. I heard footsteps upstairs, the water running, doors opening and closing. But no one came down. No one knocked. The silence grew louder than any words could. I stood there with the same clothes from the night before, afraid to use the shower, afraid to open the fridge, afraid to exist in that space that wasn't really mine. Eventually, I heard his voice, through the floor, calm, casual. He was on a call, probably for work. He was laughing, telling a story. It struck me how light his voice sounded, how easy it was for him to smile when I wasn't around. That hurt more than I can explain. Because I had imagined this visit as a healing, a moment where time would fold over itself and I'd see the boy I raised emerge from under the man life had turned him into. But what I saw instead was distance, not in miles, but in meaning. I stayed downstairs most of the day. I didn't want to be a bother. I heard the door open and close a few times. At one point, I peeked through the basement window and saw him leaving with his wife. They didn't say anything to me, didn't invite me along. Just left. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching the light shift across the floor. My suitcase was still half open. The little packages I brought from Brazil, small souvenirs, some sweets, a handmade apron I embroidered with his name, still lay there untouched. I thought about putting them back. Maybe he wasn't ready. Maybe I came at the wrong time. Maybe I should have waited for another invitation, one that didn't feel so reluctant. I kept replaying the messages he used to send me. The ones that always said the same thing. "I miss you, Mom." That sentence. so short, so powerful. I used to write it in my diary. I used to whisper it to myself when I walked home from work, alone, carrying heavy bags of groceries for just one person. I missed you too, meu filho, every second, and now you were just upstairs, and I was more invisible than when we were a continent apart. That evening, he finally came down. He didn't sit, just stood by the stairs with his arms crossed. "Are you okay down here?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes, it's a little cold, but I'm fine, thank you." He looked uncomfortable. "If you need anything, just let me know. I could help around the house," I offered. "Cook something. Maybe the kids would like some pão de queijo?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "They already ate, and maybe it's best not to be in the kitchen too much. You know, routines. Routines. That word felt like a slap. I was disrupting his routine. He didn't say it, but I heard it anyway. I lowered my eyes, trying to hide the sting. "Of course," I said. He lingered for a moment, then left. No hug, no warmth, just a polite nod and silence again. The days that followed were more of the same. I heard the kids sometimes. One of them even said, "Grandma?" at the top of the stairs once. I looked up, heart pounding. But before I could answer, I heard the mother's voice call them away. No explanations, no questions. I stayed where I was, out of sight, out of mind. I started cleaning the little space I had, just to feel useful. I folded and refolded my clothes, wrote in my journal, listened to the hum of the appliances, the creak of footsteps above. I tried to hold on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, this was all just awkwardness that would pass. That maybe on the last day, there would be a real goodbye, a proper one, a tear, a smile, something to prove this wasn't all in vain. But deep down, something had already cracked. That fragile link we shared, mother and son, it had been strained for years. And now, face to face, it was unraveling thread by thread. One afternoon, I sat by the basement window and watched a bird build a nest in the tree just outside. It worked so hard, tiny piece by tiny piece, to make a home. And I thought of how I did the same thing, back when he was small. When I worked double shifts and still came home to cook for him, wash his clothes, read to him until he fell asleep. Every day, I built that nest, hoping he'd one day soar, but never forget where he came from. Now, I wondered, had he forgotten? Or worse, did he remember and choose to erase it? That night, I heard them talking in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to listen, but the vents carried voices down like whispers. I heard his wife say, "She can't stay too long, it's risky." And his answer? "If she stays, immigration could come." I felt my heart stop. He was talking about me, like I was a threat, like I was illegal. I had no intention of staying. I wasn't trying to move in or overstay anything. I was a mother visiting her son, that's all. But in that moment, I wasn't a guest. I was a liability. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat on the mattress with my back against the wall, listening to the wind outside, the fridge humming, my own breathing, shallow and uneven. The silence pressed down on me like a weight. Have you ever felt that way? Like the people you love most have built a world where you no longer fit? Like your existence is something they need to manage? If you have, if you've ever walked into a place you thought was home only to realize you were just a visitor, or worse, a burden, please share your heart in the comments, even if it's just one sentence. Right, I've felt it too, because sometimes that's enough to remind someone they're not the only one surviving the silence. And if you're still watching, tell me, where are you watching from? Knowing your stories, your places, your pain, it helps me keep telling mine. Let's keep going together. The next morning, I moved a chair closer to the basement window just to feel a little sunlight, just to remind myself that the world still existed outside that cold, quiet space. I sat there, holding a small scarf I had knitted for my granddaughter. I ran my fingers over the stitches. Soft pink yarn, delicate and warm. I imagined her wearing it to school, smiling, telling her friends, "My grandma made this for me." I had pictured that moment so clearly back home. I imagined her hugging me, laughing, showing me her drawings, asking about Brazil, about what I liked to cook. I imagined us walking in a park, holding hands like I used to do with her father when he was her age. But she hadn't even seen me. And if she had, I don't know if she knew who I was. At some point that morning, I heard footsteps again. Laughter. A door creaking open. I stood quickly and straightened my blouse, hoping, foolishly, that someone was coming down. Maybe my son. Maybe the kids. Maybe it was time for that breakfast together. Maybe it was finally that moment I'd been waiting for since I landed. But the steps stopped, then faded, then silence. So I sat back down, pressing the scarf to my chest like it could keep my heart from breaking further. That's when I heard it. The front door opened again, and I recognized my son's voice. He was greeting someone outside. His tone was bright, friendly, so different from how he'd spoken to me. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. Yeah, just working from home today," he said cheerfully. I didn't recognize that version of him. So relaxed, so charming. The kind of tone you use with neighbors you respect, or people whose opinion you care about. I leaned closer to the window and peeked through the curtains. He was standing in the driveway, laughing with a man about his age, holding a cup of coffee. I watched him gesture toward the house and then casually say something I couldn't hear. He looked proud, comfortable. There was no sign that inside that very house, his mother, the woman who gave him life, was sitting in a cold basement, afraid to even come up for a cup of tea. I pulled away from the window and sat down again, slower this time. My body felt heavier. Not just from age, from humiliation. It was like I had entered his world without permission. Like I had walked into a dream where I didn't belong, and the only thing I could do now was disappear without making noise. And that's when it truly hit me. I wasn't part of his American life, not even as a memory, not even as a guest. That evening, he finally came downstairs again. I was sitting quietly, crocheting a blanket I'd started before the trip. He glanced at it and gave a small, tired smile. "You're still doing that?" he asked. "Yes," I answered. "It helps pass the time." He nodded, sat down at the bottom step, and rubbed his face. "Sorry, I haven't been around much. Things have been a little crazy." "It's okay," I said. I was always forgiving him, even when the silence was louder than his apologies. We sat in silence for a while. Then I decided to ask, gently, "Do the kids know I'm here?" He hesitated. "They know a relative is visiting, but we haven't told them everything." "Why not?" He looked up at me, and I saw it, that fear again. Not sadness, not guilt, just pure, cold fear. "Mom, it's just complicated." "Complicated how?" I asked, even though I already knew. I needed to hear it. I needed him to say it out loud. He exhaled slowly. "Things are different here. You being here, if someone sees you, asks questions, it could become a problem." "A problem for who?" I whispered. "For all of us," he said, and then added, almost inaudibly, "If you stay too long, immigration might get involved." There it was again, that sentence, that wound. If she stays, immigration will come. I stared at him, speechless, because in that moment, I wasn't his mother anymore. I was a liability. I was risk. I was undocumented flesh sitting in his basement, threatening the neat, successful image he had built for himself. I was his shame. And yet, I smiled. Not because I meant it, but because when you've spent your whole life putting your child's comfort before your own, the instinct doesn't die, even when your heart does. He left shortly after that. Said he had work. Said he'd check on me later. But he didn't. And that night, I lay awake wondering how a woman could carry a child for 9 months, raise him for 20 years, and then become a threat in his eyes. How did I go from being his protector to something he had to protect against? I thought back to when he was little, maybe 4 or 5. There was a time he came home with bruises on his arm. A group of older boys had pushed him down. He ran into the house crying, his small body trembling with fear. I scooped him up, kissed his forehead, and swore to him, "No one will ever hurt you again." Now, I was the one trembling. Now, I was the one afraid. But no one would be coming to scoop me up. I was on my own. If any of you watching this have ever been made to feel like your presence was something to be hidden, if you've ever felt erased inside a family you helped build, I want you to write this in the comments. I existed before their shame. Just those words. Because sometimes, that's all we need. a reminder that we were there long before we were pushed aside. And tell me where you're listening from. I know I'm not the only one holding back tears right now. You're not invisible here. I see you. I hear you. And I promise, we'll keep going. I started to avoid walking too hard on the basement floor, afraid that even the sound of my footsteps would become a nuisance. I didn't want to cause tension. I didn't want to attract attention. That phrase haunted me now. Everything I did had to be small, quiet, calculated, as if I was a shadow that had overstayed its welcome. The woman who gave birth to him was now an uninvited whisper in his house. The next morning, I heard the children laughing upstairs. Their little voices brought a kind of ache I hadn't prepared for. I pressed my ear closer to the vent, even though I hated myself for doing it. But it was the only way to hear them. I heard my grandson yell, "Who's in the basement?" And then her voice, cold, firm, clipped, "No one. Finish your cereal." I froze. No one. That's what I had become. Not grandma. Not mom. Just no one. She knew I heard her. I think that's why she said it so loud. Like she wanted me to hear. Like she wanted to remind me I was a secret now. Something to keep hidden from the children. I don't know if they were told I was dangerous or if they were simply told nothing at all. But the message was clear. I was not to exist in their world. That night, I stood by the door at the top of the stairs, my hand resting on the knob. I wanted to turn it. I wanted to walk into that kitchen, pour myself a cup of coffee, sit at the table like a human being. But I didn't. Because what would I say? What would they say? Would she look at me with that same look she gave me when I first arrived? Like I was a complication that wouldn't go away? Instead, I went back downstairs and cried quietly into my pillow. Not because I was sad. I was used to sadness. I cried because I was ashamed. Ashamed that I had raised a son who could look at me and see inconvenience. Ashamed that I still loved him, even when he made me feel like trash beneath his carpet of success. A few days later, she came down for the first time. It startled me. I had gotten so used to being ignored, I forgot what it was like to have someone look me in the eye. She didn't greet me. She didn't ask how I was. She just looked around and said, "We'll need this space cleaned out by Sunday. We have guests next week." I nodded. She turned to leave, but I gathered courage. "Have the children asked about me?" I asked softly. She turned, eyes narrowed. "They're fine. Don't worry about them. I made something for your daughter," I said, holding out the little pink scarf I had crocheted. She glanced at it and then, without taking it, said, "They don't need anything, thank you." She didn't say it, but I heard it loud and clear. "We don't need you." After she left, I sat back on the mattress and stared at the scarf. I folded it neatly and placed it back in my suitcase. I didn't cry that time. Not immediately. I just felt hollow. I felt like I had become part of the furniture, present but never acknowledged, alive but not living. It reminded me of the time I worked as a housemaid when my son was just a toddler. I used to clean houses far wealthier than my own. The women I worked for would walk past me like I wasn't there, talk over me like I was deaf, leave rooms silent when I entered. I had promised myself back then, one day I'll be more than this. But here I was, again, being erased by silence. And this time, not by strangers. This time, by my own blood. I tried one last time. I baked something. Something simple, pão de queijo, the kind he loved as a boy. I used what I found in the pantry. I wasn't even sure it would come out right, but I wanted to do something, be something again. I waited until the house was empty. Then I went upstairs and placed them on a plate, left it on the kitchen counter, and went back down. I never heard a word. No thank you. No, did you make this? Nothing. Later that day, I went up again to check the trash, and there they were. All of them. Uneaten. Thrown away. My hands trembled as I closed the lid. Not from anger. Not even from sadness. But from the weight of understanding. They didn't want my food, my love, my memories. They wanted me gone, disappeared, forgotten. And the worst part? I stayed. I stayed in that house because I still had hope, because I still believed that maybe, my son would remember something, anything about who I was, about what I meant, about what I gave up so he could live in a place like that, with people like her. But he never came downstairs again. Not once. I heard him leave for work. I heard the children play. I heard the sound of dinner being served. But my door never opened again. Even now, I still question myself. Was it something I did? Was I too old? Too foreign? Too embarrassing? Or was I just a mirror that showed him where he came from? And maybe that's what he couldn't bear to look at, because for some people, shame speaks louder than love. If you've ever felt like your presence made people uncomfortable simply because of who you are, I want you to share that pain in the comments. Write this phrase, "I'm not invisible." Write it for you, for your mother, for your grandmother, for every woman who has ever been made to feel like a burden when all she ever gave was love. And let me know where you're watching from. I want to feel where these stories are landing. I want to know that someone, somewhere, is listening. Even if the people closest to us are not. We still have so much more to uncover together. It happened during a thunderstorm. The kind of night that reminds you of old things you'd rather forget. The sky cracked open around midnight and the lights flickered. For a second, I thought they'd go out. I almost hoped they would. Maybe then someone would come downstairs to check on me. Maybe my son would remember how storms used to frighten him as a child, how I'd hold him close and whisper stories into his ear until he could fall asleep again. But no one came. Just like every other night, I was alone in that cold, hollow basement, sitting in the dark with my thoughts, surrounded by a silence that no thunder could compete with. That was the night I started to feel like I was vanishing. Not metaphorically, physically. Like the more I stayed quiet, the more I became part of the wall. The more I swallowed my pain, the more my presence shrank, until I wasn't sure if I was even real anymore. I stood up and walked slowly to the mirror on the wall, a tiny one, old and chipped, probably forgotten by whoever used the room before me. I looked at myself, really looked. My skin had thinned, my hair grayer than I remembered. My face had lines I didn't know were there. But it wasn't the age that startled me. It was the expression. I didn't recognize her. She looked tired in a way sleep couldn't fix, empty in a way no love had ever touched. And then, like a sharp slap across my chest, I heard the words again, replaying in my mind, his voice, my son's voice. If she stays, immigration might come, over and over like a cruel lullaby. He didn't say it to me. He didn't need to. I heard it anyway. Heard it through the vent, through the hallway, through the walls, and I would never unhear it. I would never be able to unknow that I was a problem, a complication, a potential report waiting to happen. He hadn't said, "I'm scared for her." He hadn't said, "I want to protect her." No, it was all about him, his comfort, his fear, his image. And for the first time in my life, I wondered if he ever truly saw me at all. Did he remember the nights I stitched his torn school uniform by hand? The days I skipped meals so he could eat? The weekends I worked extra hours in a stranger's house so he could have new shoes? Or did he erase all of it the moment he crossed the border? Did he trade my sacrifice for silence? That thought stayed with me for days. I started to withdraw even more, if that was even possible. I barely moved around the basement. I kept the lights off most of the time. I ate less. I didn't want to take up space. I didn't want to be seen. Because now I knew being seen was dangerous. Being seen meant someone might report me. It was surreal, like I was living someone else's story. I had raised a child with pride. I had sent him off to the world believing he would remember me, honor me, that he'd tell his children stories about the mother who made miracles out of nothing, that he'd hang photos of our little house back in Brazil, that he'd say, "This is where I came from. This is who made me who I am." But there were no photos of me in his house, not even one. And that wasn't by accident, that was deliberate. The erasure had already happened long before I arrived. I remember once when he was still a teenager, he asked me why I never remarried, why I stayed alone all those years. I smiled at him and said, "Because I already had everything I needed. You." I wasn't lying. He was the reason I breathed. He was the reason I got up every morning and fought through life's hurricanes. And now, he wouldn't even look me in the eye. One afternoon, I gathered what little courage I had left and asked him if we could talk. Just the two of us. He hesitated, checked his watch, said he was in the middle of a deadline but maybe later. Later never came. 3 days passed, then 4, and I realized he was never going to talk to me. Not really, not deeply. Not the way a son talks to his mother when he still remembers who she is. And maybe that was the most painful part of it all. Not the silence, not the rejection, but the realization that the little boy who used to curl up beside me and beg for one more bedtime story was gone, replaced by a man who saw me as a threat, an obstacle. He never even asked me why I came. He never asked me what I'd gone through to get there. How I sold nearly everything I had just to afford the plane ticket. How I practiced English phrases in front of the mirror so I wouldn't embarrass him in front of the neighbors. He never asked, because he didn't want to know. Because knowing would mean seeing, and seeing would mean remembering, and remembering might hurt. So he chose to forget. He chose to turn his face away, just like he did at the airport, when instead of hugging me, he looked over his shoulder first, just to be sure no one saw. That memory haunts me more than any other. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. In that moment, I saw exactly how he felt. He wasn't scared of losing me. He was scared of being seen with me. And that kind of fear, it leaves a scar no apology can heal. If you've ever felt like someone you love more than life itself was ashamed of you, please say something in the comments, even if it's just, I know that pain. You don't have to tell your whole story. Just give it a voice. Your words might be the reason someone else finds the courage to speak up. Tell me where you're watching from. Share your presence. Because here, you're not invisible, not erased, not inconvenient. You're human, you matter, and your truth deserves to be heard. I lost track of how many days had passed since I arrived. Time no longer followed a rhythm in that house. It blurred between the cracks in the walls and disappeared into the silence that had swallowed me whole. I would wake up each morning and listen, not for joy, not for conversation, but just to feel alive, to remind myself that life still existed upstairs, even if it didn't reach me. There was a moment, I don't remember if it was morning or afternoon, when I heard music. Soft, cheerful, the kind of background song people play when they're preparing a meal or cleaning the house. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, listening. I imagined my daughter-in-law dancing in the kitchen, maybe the children laughing nearby. My body leaned forward just slightly, as if that sound could pull me out of the shadows I'd been living in. But then it stopped, as if it too realized I wasn't supposed to hear it. I returned to the mattress. That mattress. I don't think I'll ever forget it. Thin, uncomfortable, with a spring that poked my side whenever I moved. I started sleeping in the same position every night, curled up like a child, because it was the only way I could bear the cold. I didn't ask for more blankets. I didn't want to cause trouble. That phrase had become my new skin. Don't cause trouble. Don't be seen. Don't stay too long. I began to write letters in my head. Letters I'd never send. Words I'd never say. In them, I spoke to my son the way I used to when he was small. I reminded him of our favorite songs, the mango tree we used to climb, the rainy days when we'd sit by the window and make up stories about the people passing by. I told him that I forgave him, even though I wasn't sure I really did. But saying it, even just in my mind, made the pain feel less sharp. It dulled the edge long enough to get through the next hour. One afternoon, I saw my suitcase by the door, the same door he had asked me to sneak in through. It was sitting there like a message. You've stayed long enough. No one had said it. No one had to. The suitcase spoke louder than any word could. I sat down beside it. My hands trembled as I opened it, not because I was sad to go, but because I had come with so much hope. So many small tokens of love, a necklace I had planned to give my granddaughter, a wooden toy carved by a neighbor for my grandson, a photograph of me holding my son at the hospital when he was born. That photo was worn, creased from years of being handled. I had always kept it close, especially during hard days, like a prayer I could hold. But now it felt like a memory that no longer belonged to either of us. I tucked the photo into the side pocket of my suitcase and zipped it up. Still, I waited. I waited to be told directly. I waited for a final conversation, a goodbye, even if it was cold. I thought maybe he would say something, anything, that he was sorry, that he didn't mean for things to feel this way, that he loved me even if he couldn't show it. But there was nothing. That evening he came down briefly, holding a folded piece of paper. "It's your return ticket," he said, not meeting my eyes. My heart dropped, not from the paper but from his tone. It was like he was doing a chore, returning a package, canceling an order, not sending his mother away, but removing a problem. "I thought I'd stay a few more days," I said softly, more to test if there was space left for me. He shifted his weight and cleared his throat. "It's best if you go now. Things are complicated." That word again, complicated. I took the ticket from his hand and nodded. "When's the flight?" I asked, barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow morning." And then he left. No hug, no warmth, no remorse. I sat with that piece of paper in my lap for a long time. I stared at the black ink, my name, the flight number, the time, as if reading it enough times would make it feel less like an eviction notice. That night was the coldest of all, not because the temperature dropped, but because I finally accepted something I had been refusing to believe. My son didn't want me there. Not now, not ever. The woman who had given him everything, who had survived for him, lived for him, had become a threat to his carefully curated life. I wasn't part of his world anymore. I was a reminder of everything he wanted to forget. Still, I got up early the next day and prepared myself. I washed my face, brushed my hair, wore my best blouse, the one with the embroidered flowers. I had made it myself before the trip, imagining I'd wear it on a walk with my grandchildren. I wanted to leave with dignity, even if I was walking out of that house with a broken heart. When I came upstairs, the house was silent. He was waiting by the door with the car keys in his hand. My suitcase was already in the trunk. We drove to the airport in silence. He didn't ask if I needed anything. He didn't offer to stop for coffee. He didn't even ask how I slept. We were two strangers sharing a vehicle, separated by shame and silence. At the terminal, he pulled over and opened the trunk. I stepped out slowly, my knees aching, my hands clutching my purse like it was all I had left of myself. He handed me the suitcase and gave me a short nod. "Take care, Mom." I waited for a pause, a hug, even a forced smile. But he was already back in the car, already starting the engine, already gone. I stood there for a while, surrounded by people reuniting, laughing, crying, hugging, and I realized no one around me would ever guess that I was being sent away by my own son. That the woman with the gentle eyes and worn hands had just been erased from her child's life. I boarded the plane in silence. I looked out the window as the city shrank beneath me, wondering if he'd feel anything when he got home and found the house quieter, emptier, or maybe lighter. Maybe that's what I had become, something to remove in order to breathe easier. If you've ever been sent away from someone you thought would protect you, if you've ever had to pack your love back into a suitcase, please don't stay silent. Leave a comment below. Just a few words like, "I had to leave too," or "They asked me to go." Your truth might be what gives someone else the strength to unpack their own. Tell me what country you're watching from, what kind of silence you've survived. And if any part of this story reminds you of someone you loved, or someone who forgot how to love you back, we're not invisible here. The airport felt colder than usual. Maybe it wasn't the air conditioning. Maybe it was me. The ache inside me had settled into my bones by then. A slow, dragging kind of sadness that made every step heavier than the last. I walked slowly through the terminal, dragging my little suitcase behind me like a lifeline unraveling. People passed by in a hurry, smiling couples, families with laughing children, young men in business suits, rushing to catch connections. No one looked at me. And maybe that was fitting. I had spent the past 2 weeks invisible. Why would that change now? As I stood in line at the check-in counter, I kept replaying his voice in my head. That last moment by the car. "Take care, Mom." So short, so casual. Like I was just another person, not the woman who carried him inside her for 9 months. Not the woman who fought through poverty, shame, hunger, exhaustion, just to give him a chance at something better. No hug, no look back, just a polite, practiced phrase. The kind you use with a stranger you don't want to see again. I took my seat by the gate and stared out the window, though there was nothing to see, just gray skies and rain beginning to tap softly against the glass. It was almost poetic, like the sky was crying for me, since I couldn't anymore. I had no tears left. I had used them all in the basement, in silence, in darkness, where no one could see or care. I tried to distract myself. I opened my purse and took out the photograph again, the one I had carried all the way from Brazil, me, holding him as a newborn, wrapped in a faded blue blanket I had sewn myself, his tiny face barely visible, my eyes looking down at him with a love so loud it didn't need words. I traced my finger over the picture, and something in my chest squeezed so hard I thought I might stop breathing. Because that woman in the photo, that younger version of me, she had no idea what was coming. She didn't know that 30 years later, the baby in her arms would look at her like a burden. That's the part that breaks you the most, you know? Not the rejection itself, but the naivety you carried before it. The blind hope. The belief that love was enough. That sacrifice guaranteed something. That motherhood had some kind of spiritual contract that would never be torn apart. But it does get torn. It gets ripped, sometimes without warning. And what's worse is that sometimes the person holding the knife is someone you still love. The flight was delayed. I sat there for nearly 2 hours waiting. Not that I was in a hurry. There was no one waiting for me back home. No party, no reunion. Just an empty apartment with a table too big for one person and a bed that had long forgotten how to offer comfort. The woman sitting next to me started a conversation. She was Brazilian too. I could tell by her accent. She said she had just come from visiting her grandchildren in Boston. Showed me pictures of them. They had drawn her cards, made her breakfast, slept in her bed. They cried when I left, she said, laughing softly. I cried too, but at least I know I'm loved. I smiled. A kind smile, the kind you give when your heart is bleeding, but you don't want to spill it onto someone else's happiness. She asked me if I had grandchildren. I nodded. And? Were they happy to see you? I looked down at the floor. I don't think they even knew I was there. She went quiet after that. Maybe she understood. Maybe she didn't. But she didn't ask anything else. And I was grateful for that. Because if she had, I'm not sure I could have held myself together. Eventually, we boarded. As I buckled my seatbelt and leaned my head back, I realized something. I had come to the United States hoping to reconnect with my son, but I was leaving with something else entirely, the final proof that I had been erased. And yet, I couldn't hate him. I wanted to. God knows I did. I wanted to scream, to break something, to write him a letter so sharp it would cut him the way his silence had cut me. But even in my pain, I loved him. I loved him. That was the cruelest part, the part that no betrayal could touch. And that's what so many people don't understand about a mother's heartbreak. It doesn't come from the distance. It comes from the fact that you still care, that you still want to be chosen, even after everything, that you would still say yes if they asked you to stay. Halfway through the flight, I pulled out my notebook. I hadn't written anything real in weeks. I had scribbled thoughts, imagined conversations. But now, I started a letter. Not to him. To myself. The woman I had abandoned over and over to serve everyone else. The woman who had always come last on her own list. I wrote, "You are not a mistake. You are not a shame. You are not a threat to anyone's comfort. You were a mother before they became strangers." I kept writing. Pages and pages. I wrote about the mango tree, about the birthday cakes I made out of flour and sugar when money was tight, about the fever nights and the music he used to hum when he fell asleep on my chest. I wrote it all down like a history that no one else would care to remember, but one that mattered to me. That defined me, because if I didn't write it, who would? The plane landed. The lights came on. People stretched, called relatives, talked excitedly about plans. I sat still. I wasn't excited. I wasn't going home. I was returning to a life that no longer fit, a country that felt more like a waiting room than a place to live. But at least I knew the truth now. I walked out of the terminal into the humid air of São Paulo, my body heavier than when I left, but my heart oddly lighter. Because sometimes the most painful clarity is better than the sweetest lie. At least now I knew where I stood, and it wasn't in his heart. If you've ever returned from a journey more broken than when you left, If you've ever realized someone closed the door and left you outside, I want you to write something in the comments. Just a few words. Something like, I came back with nothing but the truth. Or, they didn't open the door. Or even, I was never really welcome. You can say whatever feels real. Because this space is yours too. And if you don't speak, who will? Tell me where in the world you're listening from. Whether you've ever walked out of an airport knowing the place you just left behind left you first. We still have more to uncover. The heat hit me the moment I stepped outside the airport. Not just on my skin, in my chest. It wrapped around me, thick and suffocating, like a truth I didn't want to face. São Paulo hadn't changed much since I left, but I had. Or maybe it's better to say, what I believed in had. I took a cab home, the same route I'd taken years ago when I went to visit relatives or to run errands in the city. But that time, the road felt longer, as if every building I passed was quietly watching me, whispering, "You came back alone." When I got to the apartment, I stood in front of the door for a long time before turning the key. It was the same lock, same doormat, same potted plant half dead in the corner. But I didn't recognize anything. It all felt unfamiliar, like I was walking into someone else's life. A version of myself I had abandoned for a dream that had thrown me away. I opened the door, and the silence inside wrapped around me fast. Not like a hug, but like a sheet over a corpse. It was cold. Not because of temperature, because no one had waited for me. No scent of food, no voice, no question of how was your trip. I stood there with my suitcase and felt, for the first time in my life, like I didn't belong anywhere anymore. Not there either, not anywhere. I put the kettle on just to hear a sound. I poured the water, let the steam fog up the window, and sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I used to imagine sitting with my son again, telling stories, sharing coffee, watching his children run around. Instead, I was alone with the hum of the refrigerator and the clink of my spoon against the mug. I thought I would cry, but I didn't. Because something in me had shut off. Not cold, not bitter, just closed, like a book with its last chapter ripped out. That night, I didn't sleep. I just lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, counting the tiny cracks like they were hours. I had come back with the same clothes, the same suitcase, the same purse. But I was not the same woman, and I couldn't go back to being her. The next morning, I took out everything from my bag. The scarf I had crocheted for my granddaughter, still folded, never worn. The wooden toy for my grandson, the necklace, all untouched, all symbols of a love that wasn't allowed to arrive. I placed them on the table and stared at them. Then I got angry, not at him, at myself, because I had made myself small. I had agreed to disappear. I had obeyed every silent command. Stay down. Don't speak. Don't be seen. And for what? For a son who couldn't look me in the eye? For grandchildren who didn't know my name? For a house that locked me under its floor like I was a ghost? No, I deserved more. I had given more. So why was I begging for crumbs of affection like a stray dog? I took a notebook from the shelf and began writing again. Not just letters, not just thoughts, but everything. The beginning, the middle, the pain, the truth, not to accuse, but to remember. Because if I didn't write it, it would die inside me. And I had already buried too many parts of myself. I wrote about the day I gave birth to him, the look in his eyes, the way I held him to my chest and whispered, "You are my everything." I wrote about the nights I walked to work in the rain because the bus money had to be saved, about how I learned to stretch one bag of rice into 3 meals, about how I sat outside his school with a torn umbrella just to make sure he got in safely. I wrote it all, and I wept as I did, not because I wanted pity, but because I finally realized I mattered, even if he forgot, even if he erased, even if he was too scared of losing his version of the American dream to make room for the woman who gave him life. I still mattered. And if you're listening to this, maybe you need to hear that too. Maybe you've been silenced. Maybe you were sent away. Maybe you knocked and no one answered. Maybe you looked into the eyes of someone you loved more than your own life and saw nothing. If that's you, please comment right now. Say something like, "I'm done being invisible," or "I was never just a guest, I was the foundation." Or write your own words, what you feel, what you couldn't say before. I promise you, someone else will read it and feel seen for the first time. Because the worst kind of loneliness is not being alone. It's being erased by someone you taught how to speak. The days that followed were quiet, but no longer empty. There was a shift in the air, not around me, but inside me. Something had cracked open. Something that had been buried under decades of sacrifice, obedience, silence. I woke up each morning and made coffee, not because someone was waiting to drink it, but because I deserved to start my day warm. I washed my clothes by hand like I used to, but this time I sang while I did it. Not because anyone was listening, but because my voice, even cracked, even tired, still existed. I was no longer asking for permission to take up space. I started walking again, not far, just around the block. The same streets that had once felt like routines now felt like quiet blessings. The corner bakery where the old man still sold bread with a smile. The tiny fruit stand run by the same woman who used to give my son an extra banana when he was small. These little places, these little faces, they remembered me. They asked how I'd been. They said, "We missed seeing you." And those words, they hit me harder than any goodbye my son never gave. Because they didn't come from obligation. They came from presence, from people who still knew I existed. One afternoon, I was walking past the small park near my building when I saw a little girl running with her arms out like wings. Her mother chased behind, laughing breathlessly, calling her back. The sound of their joy was like a balm I didn't know I needed. It reminded me of the days when I used to do that. Run after my boy, calling his name, pretending to be tired just so he could feel like he was faster than me. I sat on the nearest bench and just watched, letting the sun fall on my face, letting the moment live without rushing it away. It was the first time in weeks, maybe months, that I felt something close to peace. But it didn't last, because grief never leaves completely. It returns in waves. That night, I opened my phone. I hadn't touched it since the day I landed. I had no messages, no missed calls. I opened his name in the contacts and stared at it. My finger hovered over the screen. Should I call? Just to hear his voice? Just to ask how the children were? I didn't, because I knew he wouldn't answer. And worse than silence is rejection. Worse than wondering is confirmation. But I did something else. I opened a message window, and I wrote, "I hope one day you tell your children about me." I didn't send it. I just stared at it. Because the truth is, I didn't write it for him. I wrote it for me. To see those words on a screen. To admit the longing, the wish, the invisible thread I couldn't cut, no matter how much he tried to sever it from his end. I deleted the message and locked the phone. Sometimes healing isn't loud. It's quiet. It's private. It's learning how to put yourself to bed with no goodnight kiss and still waking up the next morning with a breath of purpose. And then something strange happened. A letter arrived, not from him, but from someone I hadn't heard from in years. It was from my sister. We had lost touch. Life had pulled us in different directions, and after our mother died, our contact had slowly faded into birthdays and forwarded prayers. But the letter wasn't just small talk. She wrote, "I heard you went to see your boy." And then, one line that cracked something open in me. "I know how it feels to be loved in secret." Those words wrecked me, because I had never told anyone that. But she knew. She had seen it. Maybe in her own life, maybe in mine. Maybe in the way women like us are expected to love with our whole bodies, our entire youth, all our breath, and then disappear gracefully when we're no longer convenient. She continued, "I remember the day you left. You were glowing. You packed your things with so much care. You told me, 'I'm going to be a grandmother again. I'm going to hold them.' You smiled like a girl, like a dream was about to bloom. And I don't know what happened over there. I don't need to know. But I just want to say this. You are not crazy. You are not dramatic. You are not imagining it. You are not the shame. You are the root. Without you, there is no tree." I held that letter like it was holy, like it could breathe. I read it over and over again, letting her words remind me of what I had almost forgotten, that my existence mattered, even if I wasn't acknowledged by the ones I gave everything to. Because this is what people like to erase: the fact that motherhood does not come with a guarantee. You can pour every drop of yourself into a child, and they can still walk away. You can feed them your dreams, dress them in your hunger, build their future out of your brokenness, and they can still look at you with a stranger's eyes. And still, you will love them. Because that's what we do, not out of weakness, but out of a strength this world will never fully respect. That night, I took the scarf I had made for my granddaughter and placed it around my neck. I wore it like armor. Not because it was meant for me, but because the love I stitched into it was still mine. I boiled water for tea, lit a candle, opened my window, and I whispered to no one in particular, "I'm not gone. I'm not broken. I'm still here." If you've ever had to remind yourself of your own worth when everyone else forgot, I want you to say something in the comments. Say, "I'm still here," or "I was the root," even if they cut me down. Or write your own truth, even if it's one sentence, even if it's messy, even if it hurts, because pain left unspoken becomes shame. And we have carried enough of that for 1,000 lifetimes. After reading my sister's letter, I left it on the kitchen table for 3 days. Not because I didn't want to answer, but because every time I passed by it, I felt something rise in my chest, something that had been asleep for a long time. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was rage. Maybe it was simply the realization that someone, somewhere, still saw me as human. I started writing her back, not in a rush, not to explain everything, but just to say thank you. Thank you for reminding me that being discarded doesn't mean you have no value, that even if a house no longer wants you, your story still belongs to you. I wrote about the cold basement, about the footsteps I used to hear above me, about the moment I realized my presence was being measured like a ticking clock, that any second longer and I'd become a threat. But I also wrote about the scarf, the toy, the photograph, and I told her. I still kept them. I couldn't leave them behind, because I needed something to prove I had arrived. Sometimes we carry objects not because of what they are, but because of what they witnessed. Those 3 gifts, untouched, unopened, had seen more pain than any person in that house had dared to acknowledge. They were my witnesses, my proof, my truth, wrapped in silence. And that's when I started to feel something return to me. Not joy, not forgiveness, but voice. I began writing every day. At first, just a few lines, then pages, then full notebooks. I wasn't writing for anyone else. I wasn't planning to publish. I didn't even think I'd ever let another person read them. But writing became a ritual, a way to collect the pieces of myself that had scattered across the floor of that basement. I wrote about being a mother, not the romantic kind, the real kind, the kind who wipes tears with a sleeve because there's no tissue, who goes to sleep with an empty stomach so her child doesn't have to, who sits in silence while being erased, just to keep the peace. I wrote about the dreams I gave up without realizing they were dreams. How I learned to be proud of simple things, a clean home, a full fridge, a healthy child, because no one told me I was allowed to want more. I wrote about the moment my son learned English faster than I did, and how that was the beginning of the distance. Because that's how it starts sometimes, not with cruelty, but with translation. One day, they need you for everything, and the next, they're correcting your accent, hiding your stories, telling you to wait in the car because your presence complicates things. And if you don't name that loss, it grows teeth. It eats you from the inside. It makes you question your memory, your sacrifice, your right to be proud. But I was done questioning. So I wrote, and when the words ran out, I started moving. I cleaned the apartment, not just out of habit, but like I was preparing to inhabit my own life again. I opened windows that hadn't seen daylight in months. I threw away old clothes that smelled like fear. I found a blouse I had bought years ago but never wore. Too bright, too bold, too joyful. I put it on and looked in the mirror. It didn't fit the woman I had become, but it fit the one I wanted to remember. I walked to the community center that afternoon. There was a small group of older women who met there for crocheting and conversation. I had passed them many times before. always telling myself I was too tired, too sad, too ashamed. But that day, I walked in, and they welcomed me like I had always belonged. We didn't talk about pain right away. We talked about thread and color and patterns. We talked about the heat and the price of tomatoes. But behind every smile, I saw it, a quiet knowing, a shared history. You can see it in the eyes of women who've carried more than they were ever meant to. Over time, the stories began to come out. One had been left by a husband who found a younger woman. Another had a son in Europe who never called. One cried while talking about the daughter who only sent money but hadn't visited in 5 years. And as I listened, I realized I was not alone. This pain, this silence, this exile in your own family, it was a wound we all shared, hidden behind polite smiles and practiced recipes. Wounds we didn't name because we were taught that love means endurance, even when it breaks you. But in that circle, no one was invisible. No one had to whisper. And that changed everything for me. I began reading my writings to them. At first, I was shy. My voice shook, my hands trembled. But when I finished the first page, they clapped. Not because it was perfect, but because it was theirs too. They had lived it. They had buried it. And now, they were breathing it back out. One of them said, "You should share this with more people." I laughed. "Who would want to hear it?" And she looked at me and said, "Everyone who's ever been silenced." That night, I sat at my table, lit a candle, and asked myself, what if there are thousands of women like me? What if someone, somewhere, is sitting in a basement right now, believing she is the problem? What if she's packing a gift that no one will ever open and thinking it's her fault? What if my voice could be the mirror she needs? And that's when I decided. I may have left that house in silence, but I would not stay silent. I would tell my story, even if only one person listened. Because sometimes that's all it takes. Just one voice breaking the silence, and the whole world begins to shift. If any part of this feels like your story, I want you to write it down, even just one line. Say something like, "My story matters," or "I've lived this too," or give a word to the pain, a name to the silence, a home to the voice you were told to hide. You are not invisible here, and your voice is stronger than you think. There is a kind of silence that doesn't hurt anymore. It just sits with you, like an old friend who doesn't need to speak to be understood. That's the silence I live with now, the silence that followed the storm. After all the words that were never said, after all the rooms I was never invited into, after all the doors that were quietly closed behind me. But this silence, it doesn't suffocate me anymore. It reminds me that I survived. I didn't get the embrace I dreamed of. I didn't hear the words I longed for. My grandson never wore the sweater I crocheted, and my granddaughter will grow up not knowing how my voice sounds when I laugh. But still, I am here. I speak. I write. I wake up with both grief and grace in my lungs. Some days, the pain is loud. The memory of being hidden, erased, rejected, it climbs into bed with me, lays beside me like a weight I've learned to carry. But most days, I rise anyway. I stretch. I make coffee. I listen to the radio. I water the plants. I step out into the world like I deserve to be seen. Because I do. My worth was never theirs to give or take. I'm not the version of myself that left for America. That woman was full of hope, wrapped in dreams, holding gifts like offerings. I returned with nothing in my hands, but everything I needed already inside me. And if I had to live it all over again, I would. Because even in that basement, even when I was being erased from my own family's story, I still loved. I still gave. I still stood in the fullness of my identity. And that they cannot take. To every person who has watched this far, listened this deeply, and shared in this journey with me, I want to say thank you. From the softest, truest part of my heart. Maybe you don't know what it means to be sent away. Maybe you do. Maybe you've never been to a basement, but maybe you felt the same cold, the cold of being left out, of being ignored, of giving everything and still being treated like too much. Maybe like me, you've loved someone who forgot how to look at you. Maybe you've been the one no one talks about. If that's true, then I want you to know, I see you. I see your strength. I see the invisible sacrifices. I see the way you keep showing up, even when no one claps, even when no one thanks you, even when no one opens the door. You are not forgotten. You are not too much. You are the root, the blood, the beginning, and your story matters. Every time someone watches this video, I imagine them sitting at a table like mine, maybe with tea, maybe in silence, letting these words wrap around their pain and remind them, you are not alone. If this story moved something in you, I invite you to leave a comment, share a word, a phrase, a memory. Say, I survived too, or I'm reclaiming my story, or simply write, thank you, and know it means the world. And if you haven't yet, I gently invite you to subscribe to this channel. Here, we tell stories that matter. Stories of survival, of silence, of heartbreak, and of healing. Stories that honor the women who raised us, who broke so we could breathe, who disappeared so we could be seen. Every new subscriber is like another light turned on in a dark room. Stay with us. And before you go, there's another video waiting for you, right here on the screen. It's another story like this one, real, raw, and unforgettable. A voice that, like mine, refuses to be silenced. Click on it. Let the journey continue. And remember, even when they try to erase you, you still exist.